Okay. Thanks. So basically, in the case of non-independent subgoals, there can be some number of. So in general, if you have n subgoals, some of them may be independent. Some sets are positively interacting, some sets are negatively interacting. Because of which the length of the plan for all n goals may be equal to, less than, or greater than L1 plus L2 plus L. You'd say a fat lot of good it does for me, but it's a useful qualitative understanding to have. It's a very useful qualitative understanding to have, because this is where essentially plans become longer versus shorter. And in general, the simplest case of solving planning problems would happen when? If I get one of these three cases, if I get to choose one of these three cases, where would be the simplest case? Simplest case, what? The first one. They're all independent, not positive interactions, independent. Okay. And if it is, and the hardest is negative, because in the case of negative interactions, just finding a plan might take a longer time, because the search for plan, essentially, if you're doing in the progression search or the regression search, the depth of the search will be the length of the plan. In the case of purely negative interactions, the depth will be higher. So you tend to do more search. Just finding a plan. Okay, with the positive interactions, things become slightly interesting. In the case of positive interactions, if you're just trying to find a plan, it's as easy as independent subgoals. You see what I'm saying? In that previous case, I put action A1, which gave P as well as Q, but I don't notice that, and I work on Q separately, for which I put action A2. Now I have both A1 and A2. It's a longer plan, but it gives me P and Q. Do you understand what I'm saying? So in the case, yes, go ahead.
I just have a question about the negative interactions. In the reading, it talked about how in the plan space heuristic, you assume that there are no negative reactions or negative interactions.
No, it's that you're jumping ahead, which is, this is how planning is. Okay, in doing heuristics, you need to abstract the model. You need to kind of relax the model to find and solve the problem in the relaxed model. And the way you relax is either to ignore negative interactions or ignore negative as well as positive interactions, and negative, and even more actually. So that's basically the point you're making. It's not that plan space planning ignores negative interactions, but the heuristic for plan space planning may well be ignoring negative interactions, as does the relaxed plan heuristic.
I guess my question would be, wouldn't that lead you to this third state of always underestimating the actual cost?
Yeah, no, again, you're jumping in terms of, if you ignore negative interactions, you will underestimate, but underestimate the cost. But remember, from the intro to AI, if the only theorem that you can ever get about heuristics is if you never overestimate the cost. If you never overestimate the cost with the heuristic, then you're guaranteed to be optimal if you just use that heuristic. That means the base search without the heuristic, pure breadth first search without the heuristic would have found a solution, the optimal solution. You will find the same optimal solution hopefully faster. In general, when you're doing heuristics, if you remember the 471 discussion, the big issue is, when you find the solution, do you have any guarantees that it is sound and that it is optimal? Those are two different parts. Soundness happens because the underlying planner, whether it's the progression planner, regression planner, plan space planner, they're sound. When they stop, the plan actually generates the last goals. I mean, if you're thinking in terms of the goals of achievement, when they stop, the plan actually, if you start executing the plan from the initial state to the goal state, you will actually reach the goal state, either by the progression proof or by the regression proof or by the plan space causal link. What's not guaranteed is whether the plan you found is the optimal such plan with respect to some metric. The metric could be, for example, the number of actions, which is the simplest one we'll be thinking of. That won't be guaranteed unless our heuristic is admissible. You see what I'm saying? Soundness comes because the underlying planner is correct, which we spent last 2 classes thinking about. And optimality comes because it will come if in fact the heuristic you're using is actually admissible, which means it's never overestimates the cost, it underestimates the cost. And you remember that from 471 that bet first search is optimal, and it basically has a heuristic, it says the cost is 0 everywhere. And that's obvious on lower bound. Lower bound heuristics will be optimal. Now, when you overestimate, you lose optimality, but you can also lose completeness. You understand that? When will you lose completeness? You lose completeness if the heuristic gives for certain nodes the cost to be infinity. You understand that? If you say the cost is infinity, then you will cut that node and will never generate its children. If it turns out that the only plan is one of the descendants of that path, you lose the plan. Right? Okay. So normally people are worried that if you use overestimating heuristics that ignore negative interactions, for example, then they might prune some plans, okay, because of which you may lose completeness. But you can always, that's a minor thing. It turns out that what you can do is, instead of considering infinity to be infinity, consider it to be a large, big number, which is what you do anyway. There is no infinity. So then what happens? The F values would be, some of the nodes F values would be real big, but they're still sitting in the open list somewhere. So if you screw up, eventually you get to those nodes that you would have pruned before, because those are the only things available, and you expand it. We think this looks like a pretty big hack, but really we'll talk about how this will wind up allowing us to expand the whole notion of heuristics later on. You understand what I'm saying? If you think of heuristics as only ordering, so that means you ignore infinities and just consider infinities to be big numbers, then you never lose completeness with a heuristic. You can only lose optimality. But really, who are we kidding? Do we care about optimality? I mean, sometimes you may not care, in which case, you're happy just to find the plan first. Okay. So that's the thing you have to keep in the back of your mind as to where the complexity thing comes from. So the heuristics for planning, this is a view that I would like to think about. So there is a domain model, and then it's being fed into the planner, your strips planner. Okay. And then it could have solved the problem using progression search or regression search or plan space search or a combination thereof. And what you're doing is, there is some kind of heuristic generator there which can have various ideas. We talked about plan graph heuristics. You read about planning graph heuristics. I'll quickly talk about them. I'll also talk about another very useful idea called landmark heuristics. Landmarks are essentially finding recursive subgoals. Essentially. You understand what I'm saying? So imagine there are 2 cities. There is a huge body of water between them, and there is one bridge that connects the 2 cities. You are in 2 different, you're in some start place in the initial city R1, and you want to go to the end place in city 2. There can be many different roads you can take. But I can guarantee you that you have to pass through that bridge. Right? Because there's only one bridge. You understand what I'm saying? So in fact, the taking bridge would be an action landmark. Somewhere during your plan, you will have to take the bridge, because the goal is one side and the initial state is the other side. And similarly, any point on the bridge, for example, there is a middle of the bridge, there is some kind of a, let's say, like a toll booth. The toll booth is a fact landmark. You will pass through the toll booth. Because irrespective of how much crazy stuff you did in the first city, how much crazy stuff you did in the second city, in the middle, you have to pass through this bridge. If you have two bridges, I can say there is a disjunctive landmark. Whatever junk you do here, whatever junk you do there, you will have to pass through one of these bridges. That's the landmark heuristics. In fact, landmark heuristics are used even more these days than the planning graph heuristics that you actually read about. I'll talk about it briefly, but that's one way of getting heuristics. Yes.
In the last lecture, you're mentioning a footprint for the satisfaction requirements. Is what you just mentioned is like similar to that?
No, the footprint is actually what is required, what parts of the initial states are actually being used in completing the proof of correctness for the plan. So the rest of the facts can be removed and the plan will still be correct. Do you understand what I'm saying? This is useful. This is actually a good question. One of the things that people talk a lot about these days is generalizability, right? The point is that imagine you solved, put A on top of B problem, where the initial state had A, B, C, D. I'm sorry, initial state only had A and B and a empty hand. And the goal is put A on top of it. So on A, B is yours. You solve the problem. You found a solution. Now I put an extra block in the initial state on the table. Will the old plan work? Yeah. I put 25 extra blocks on the table. Will the old plan work? If you did this without actually redoing the planning, then you pat yourself on the back and say, I generalized my solution. My solution actually works. As long as A is clear and is on table, B is clear, then my idea of picking A, putting it on B will always work and get me on it. The rest of the properties of the initial state are irrelevant. You generalized it here, but you generalized it by causal proof. Because the footprint of the plan that is working only touched A being clear, B being clear, A being clear, and A being on table and empty. So that if you look at the proof, those are the only facts which are actually helping the proof. All other parts of the initial state, they're just hanging around. None of them matter. You see what I'm saying? That sort of a thing will be very useful for generalization. And in general, people are into generalization. This sort of stuff that I told you, it's basically, I would call it explanation-based generalization. Because I explained the correctness of the plan, the footprint of my explanation only touched some of the parts of the initial state. The rest of the parts are unnecessary. So I can basically say, even though I solved this problem with this big initial state, it actually works as long as the following things are in the initial state. Right? It's called explanation-based generalization. It comes free because I have the domain theory. On the other hand, I didn't have any domain theory, and somebody just told me outside, yeah, you're done after I did something. I don't know why I'm done. They're just happy that I'm done. They just told me that I'm done. So I've done something, and they said, you get 10 points. And you get 100 points, 100 out of 100. You have no clue why you passed the exam. At this point, if they say, I'm going to change the initial state, no. I have no idea why you passed. So anything you do might make me fail. You understand what I'm saying? Don't change anything, because with my color of my shirt, with this pen and this lighting, I passed the exam. Anything you change, God knows what happens. From there, if you then figure out, oh, I kind of realized that the color of my shirt doesn't seem to matter when I'm stacking blocks, you generalize the solution. You would say, that's a bozo test, right? But you would be a bozo if you don't understand the domain model. That's the maximum you can do. So one of the things I'm doing in this class is also trying to get you to understand there are papers from the old times, there are papers from the new times. They celebrate different things. But you need to understand, some things that those guys are doing were coming free here. That's why they were not talking about generalization. Okay. Yes, there's a question.
Some cool generalization also think, for example, if I just put one block on top of being kept it one state away from being the initial state, is that also?
Yeah, in general, there are different ways of generalizing the plans. If you know the domain model, that's basically, remember, people say learning is easier if you have causal features. You may have heard about it even before coming to this class. First, realize that planning models are all causal. You don't need to, if you ever tell me, oh, but what if I use causal features? I feel like that. Because you have only causal models. I told you the preconditions, I told you the action, I told you the effect. You do this, you get this. This causes this. Whereas when you didn't know why you passed the exam, you did a bunch of things. People came, slapped you on the back and said, hey, you got 100 out of 100. You had no idea how you passed. So all you know is this one time I succeeded. Let me not change a thing. Let me not change a thing. You understand what I'm saying? It's a very, very useful understanding. If you think in terms of pixel space, right? You have a pixel space initial state of the blocks world picture. And the pixel space goal state, a picture of the goal state. Somehow you did some actions and, the guy said, yeah, that's a correct plan. Now, the question is, if I do, if I take that picture and go into Google Photos and put Palma, which I like a lot, Palma is one of the color filters. Is this, plan going to be correct or not? Because I changed all the pixels. It's a pretty darn global change. How did you know it won't be correct? It would be correct. In fact, if the goal was about try to improve this picture, and you did some random thing, and I say, yeah, that's good, you get 100 out of 100. Then if I give you a Palma colored picture, then you're no longer sure that that change actually generalizes. And the thing that I'm asking you to understand is, if you don't know the effects of the actions that you're doing, and they just worked, and the closest thing that happens is you try to make something happen in computer, it's not working, that computer works. Can you generalize this? When else will this work? You understand what I'm saying? That's basically what you do when you don't have domain models. And then, of course, from that level of impoverishedness, anything looks like a generalization. So if you change the pixel value of the 19th pixel from 250 to 254, the plan still works, generalization. I'm caricaturing, obviously, okay, but that's the kind of thing that you can take major credit for. Whereas in the symbolic domains, we are just saying, as long as A is clear, as long as B is clear, and as long as A is on table, this damn plan works. How many pictures correspond to that initial state? Infinite number of them. You generalize from one single pixel map to infinite number of pixel maps where this plan works. You're not impressed because it doesn't have neural networks. Okay, but the point of it is you need both. You need to understand pixels, you need to understand some notion of how the actions change. Okay? Yes.
I understand that it's important to design heuristics, but I'm also wondering if there are planning problems that require the use of a specific heuristic.
Just what?
A specific heuristic.
There are different classes of heuristics, and in general, That's possible. I mean, so again, one of the things that I'm trying to do is pretty much every one of these things could have been a semester long class. I could just have spent a full semester talking about different variations of progression planning, regression planning, plan-based planning. In fact, plan-based planning was the only research that was going on for about 5-6 years when I graduated from PhD. I'm just sort of giving you pieces and trying to get you from there to the further end. But in every one of these places, of course, which heuristics work when, I wrote like a ton of papers on what kind of planning graph heuristics work in what cases. And we compressed that and made you read that AI magazine paper that none of you read, or some of you. Right. Okay. So it's true that heuristics will change, but I want you to understand what do the heuristics actually do. Again, coming back to this picture, the thing I want you to remember is we are thinking of a known domain model, known, assumed to be complete domain model on which the planner is working. And if planner basically finds a plan that is correct with respect to the model, then the planner gets full points. If that plan doesn't work in the world, it's not the problem with the planner, it's the problem with the model. Agreed? Because we made sure that the planner is not delirious. It is actually a sound planner with respect to the domain model. If it says this is a plan, it will be a plan if in fact the world exactly behaves according to that. Right? Now the heuristic essentially is taking the same domain model and trying to get essentially guidance. And so in the progression case, you start from the initial state, you have multiple states that you can get to. You can do multiple actions, you can get to multiple states. Which one would you want to expand? That's the heuristic. That's what A star search would say, F equal to G plus H. G is the number of actions you took to get to this state. H is your expectation as to how many more actions you have to take. The perfect H would be going from this state, finding the actual plan length, optimal plan length. That would be dumb because you just have to solve one problem. Now you are solving a ton of problems that are all equally custom. What the heuristic does essentially is it makes the model somehow simpler. In using this model, the heuristic is ignoring some details so that things will become easier. And you know from A star search, from discussion in this thing that, for example, the path planning, if I'm trying to find the path from here to the end of that corridor in that particular corner, I can, for example, assume that all the obstacles just disappear. That means none of you are there, none of the tables are there, in which case straight line distance is a lower bound on the distance. If there are, even after that, it starts out that I'm actually in Manhattan. You remember Manhattan distance in the lowest distance because Manhattan distance cannot be smaller than the straight line distance. If you can get a higher estimate that is still lower than the true distance, it's a better heuristic. Because the perfect heuristic will actually give you the exact distance. We talked about all of this in the 470. So heuristic here is essentially ignoring some details, like ignore the obstacles in the plan within the path planning problems. In the planning domains, what are the details it can ignore? It can ignore interactions. It can ignore negative interactions. It can ignore both negative and positive interactions. And you'll get some heuristics. That way you can solve the domain model without, if you ignore, for example, negative interactions, which is what planning graph does. The simplest planning graph ignores the negative interactions. And if you can find a path in that domain, that will be a lower bound in general. It's a good heuristic for pushing the base level planner, which is working in the full on domain. The one slight difference is that actually for it to be always a lower bound, I need to make sure that after I ignore the negative interactions, I found the optimal path with just the positive interactions. Because if I don't find the optimal path, then the length of the plan I get might be possibly, the estimate I get might be possibly longer than the true length of. Right? Because remember, these are general heuristic ideas. So imagine that the problem I gave you is get me P and Q, and A1 is giving both P and Q. But there is A1 giving P and A2 giving Q also. If you took the plan A1 giving P, A2 giving Q, and you took that as the estimate, you would have thought you need 2 units to get P and Q. With your luck, these were the only sub-goals you had to satisfy. There are negative interactions in this domain, but not in this problem. So you'll wind up essentially getting inoptimal solution. You'll get a solution, but it'll be an inoptimal solution. If you want the optimal solution, then you need to find optimal relaxed plan. Okay, so in fact, it turns out that although planning graph was the thing that I made you read, actually, it's possible to, if you have a model M1 where action A has precondition P and effect Q and not J, for example. Right? Then that's basically like writing Q and not J is sort of in the original strips formulation, you write it as add Q, delete J. That was because in that, as I heard in that lecture, we tend to think positives are good, negatives are bad. But really, all you need to ensure there are no negative interactions is that all the literals are of the same polarity. You can go with all negative literals or all positive literals. So you can either ignore the delete list or ignore the add list. Since people tend to think that normal planning problems will involve positive goals, they will ask you to achieve G instead of achieve not G. The relaxations they consider are what's called a delete relaxation. So the delete relaxation will take this action and say A1 hat still has precondition P, but the effect is just Q. Not J just disappear. If I give you a model, you can write a new model with all the deletes gone. Your planner can solve that and it'll solve it faster. Right? Because there won't be any backtracking. If you're just finding a plan, there will never be any backtracking because everything is only being added. Who is the guy who asked, who are the two people who were asking the question of why is mean sense analysis complete for theorem proving but not for planning? They ask the question and disappear. It's not good. So there was like a whole discussion on the piazza. And it turns out that the reason theorem proving was actually mean sense analysis was complete for theorem proving. Was because theorem proving is monotonic. There is no negative interactions. In the monotonic logic, you prove a condition theorem P, you can deposit it. It will never become false. Those of you who remember non-monotonic logics and probabilistic reasoning know that truth can go up in normal monotonic logic. Truth can only go one direction. Once you prove it to be true, you add more and more axioms, it doesn't become false. You know what I'm saying? In the non-monotonic logics, basically you make cut some corners, and so when you add new actions, new axioms, then you start changing your mind. For example, beauty is a bird, does it fly? Yeah, of course it flies. Beauty is an ostrich, does it fly? Oh, no, ostriches don't fly. Beauty is a magical ostrich. Oh, yeah, magical ostrich. This is non-monotonic logic. What is probability theory? Basically a generalization of non-monotonic logic. So if I, instead of asking this, Tweety is a bird, what's the probability that Tweety will fly? Tweety is an ostrich, what is the probability that Tweety will fly? That probability reduces. It doesn't have to become 1 centimeter. There could be normal, some ostriches kind of sort of like, some are really fat, so can't. Okay? So basically probabilistic reasoning is ipso facto, it is by definition non-model. But GPS, general purpose theorem proof, or GPS, which was the background for the strip solver, essentially was used for theorem proving, and it was complete. But then they tried to use it for planning, it wasn't complete. They didn't actually check it wasn't complete. They wrote the paper, probably got accepted. Because remember, one of the big things that you guys have to understand is when you write a paper, who is reading the paper? In real life, everybody is, they're called peer review. This is called peer review. Peer review basically means everybody is basically at the equal level, more or less. It is true that checking correctness might be easier than generating the solution. But sometimes even checking the correctness can be hard, and people may not have noticed that strips was incomplete for a bunch of time. And then that's just grist for more papers. Somebody else gets to write a paper saying Nilsson is wrong, strips is incomplete. Here is a counterexample. Because who is reading your papers? In fact, who is reading your papers when you submit it to conferences? Graduate students who would rather not have other graduate students write papers. Because if they don't write papers, their papers will get. One way of reducing the competition is kind of finding problems with other people's stuff. I'm exaggerating, but it's not like there is any impartial jury or anything. Science is a human endeavor. The only good thing going for science is we'll never get stuck with the same error forever and say it is in the constitution, we won't change it. There is no constitution for science. There is experiment. And the experiment says you're wrong, it doesn't matter how good the journal is which published your paper. Right? Okay. So anyway, so basically you are using this kind of a heuristic generator. And then as I said, you can start with an action with add and delete, and you do delete relaxation, the delete things will go away. And that will be a new model. In fact, the simplest way to think of domain as a planning graph heuristics is that they're essentially trying to solve that problem. That is the same problem. For example, if you are in this state and you still know what the goals are, let's say goals are G1 and G2, they're trying to figure out how to go from this state to this state, not in the first model, but in the second model, M2. And the number of actions needed to solve that problem in M2 will become an estimate of the number of actions needed to solve the actual problem in M1. And you use that estimate, add it to the G value, you get an F value, and then you use that to manipulate your search. Right? That's basically what you're doing. It's just that rather than do it this way, this is actually all you need to understand. But rather than do it this way, you can also do this like as a planning graph. If you do it as a planning graph, then you don't need to consider for every state, you don't need to reconsider how to do planning. Because planning graph sort of kind of automatically captures enough structure for any possible sub-goal, any possible goals you might be reaching from any state, that you can actually compute the plan length very fast without having to restart. So it sort of amortizes or memoizes this computation. One idea is much simpler to understand because in one idea, you basically instead of the real model, you are taking an abstract model and solving the problem with the abstract model. And the planning graph is essentially saying for the abstract model, instead of solving each problem at a time, just construct this structure called planning graph that will be usable to solve any problem that I'll give in that model. Okay, and those of you who read the paper basically can see that that's basically what planning graph is doing. Of course, the dumbest heuristic which doesn't even require planning graph is set difference, where you are essentially ignoring even actions. And you're just saying, if your current state has all the goals, then it has 0 cost. If it has, 2 goals missing, then it has 2 cost. If it has 1 goal missing, it has 1 cost. It completely ignores how many actions have to work together to achieve goal G1, even if there is no negative interactions. Just the causal chaining might be required sometimes. So set difference heuristic is the first idea. That's a dumb idea. And it turns out actually set difference heuristic is both inadmissible and uninformed. And then, you can think of this idea that the heuristic basically has to be, the best idea is that the cost of solving the problem, cost of computing the heuristic keeps increasing as you keep the new model to be as close to the old model as possible. The fewer things you abstract away, the closer it is to the old model, the original model. In which case, solving the problem would be almost as costly as solving it in the original model. If you ignore many, many details, it will be very cheap. Now, the interesting thing is that if you do actually do the H star, which is solving the every state distance to the goal in the original model, if you try to do it in the original model and you computed it for every possible state, then how much time do you need to actually solve the planning problem? It's a lookup. Because you know already the distances for every state to the goal state. You see what I'm saying? So if you do this costly a heuristic, the time taken to solve the problem itself, the base level problem solving, is very cheap. If you do very little work in the heuristic, the base level problem solving will be as high as ever. But the thing that you need to understand is the cost that you're trying to minimize is not the blue, not the green, not the red, but the blue, which is the sum of the two costs. That will be minimized somewhere in the middle. And that's kind of like the right level of abstraction that you should be thinking of to minimize the total amount of cost on a particular distribution of problem instances. That's basically the theory of heuristics. Okay, you can't easily do this, so instead, people say this side of idea seems to be working. Okay, clearly the planning graph heuristic is much more involved than just the set difference heuristic. It's much cheaper. And if you remember from the A-star search ideas, some back in Intro to AI, the Manhattan distance and number of misplaced tiles ideas are much simpler than pattern database heuristics. But they might actually solve the total problem. The total cost of solving the problem might be lower if you do more work upfront. Okay, so the planning graph stuff is almost 101 of the heuristic theory that we did, except it's being looked for our types of problems, which is basically the precondition effect problems in the strip schema models. And one of the big things in planning literature itself, classical planning, what they call the strips planning literature, is the big improvements in speed in terms of solving the planning problems came because of heuristics. Originally, people used to argue progression is better, regression is better. No, regression is better, plan space is better. No, plan space is better, half progression, half regression is better. All this nonsense. Now, essentially, you can just take progression and do good heuristics. That beats most of things. If you just want to solve the planning problems. Okay? And so that is the part where the planning graph heuristics that you read were talked about. And essentially, if you ignore the delete list, one of the interesting things that happens is that here is a way of thinking of how planning graph comes about, which is a useful thing that I discussed in that paper. If you have this eat cake, have cake problem, which is a much simpler problem, right? If you start from the initial state, then you can do an action eat, you will get this state, complete state. You can do nothing at all, in which case you get whatever state you had before. Imagine you always at any given epoch, you can just say, I don't feel like doing it. Then it will just basically be the same state. And then starting from here, you can either bake, in which case I get this state, or do nothing, in which case I get the state back. Or I can do eat, I'll get this state, or do nothing, I'll get this state. This is an actual progression tree. right? Now, I'm actually ignoring negative interactions. If I'm ignoring negative interactions, actually delete, you don't even have to remove deletes. I can just let P and not P sit in the same place. And they have no negative interactions. You understand? If you remove the deletes, yes, you won't have P and not P sitting together. But you can keep the deletes and just say P and not P can live together. So you basically ignore them killing each other. You say, you're okay. Okay. If you do that, then you can do that. One of the interesting things you can do is you can remove these state membranes. And I can say, this is just one state. I have two bags. Remove the bag and pour them all into a big one single bag. Pour all the letters into one big single bag. What I'm saying? So if you do that, there's a bag here, there's a bag here. That's what we call proposition lists in the planning graph literature. So one way you can get planning graph is construct a progression tree, remove the membranes, basically at every level, pour everything into one single grocery bag and say, this is the super state. Then at each level, you only have one state. You can see this? But if you construct planning graph this way, if you feel like constructing planning graph this way, you should hit yourself hard on the back and make yourself. Why? Because you did all the hard work. You did the entire progression tree up front. You know what I'm saying? No, if you want to have easy time in doing undergraduate study or graduate study, right? I know basically that means you don't need to have very good GPA. So what you can do is you can work very, very, very hard, get 4.0 GPA, remove some of the courses from your transcript, show only the rest of the courses. That makes people think, yeah, you were not like a bookworm, you had fun. But that's like a dumb idea. If you really don't want to be bookworm, don't take courses. Enjoy. That's a faster way to get lower GPA than getting a higher GPA and reducing it. You see what I'm saying? So instead of doing the full progression search and then removing the membranes, you would say there was never any membranes to begin with. That's exactly what planning graph does. I'm sorry. If you look at these two, this is the proposition list. These are the big bags. And these big bags are just the union of those states. Except you constructed it here directly without actually constructing the progression tree. And it's a polynomial construction. Whereas this construction, computing the progression search tree, is exponential time. Okay? None of this should be surprising. The more surprise I see, the more I know that you haven't read the paper at all. You just waited until Friday to come along, because this should not be surprising if you read the paper, because that's all this paper talked about. Anyway, except this is a different example. That's it. Okay. So, but then once you do this, in this structure, don't look at those curved gray lines. Those are mutexes. We can talk about it. But if you don't have those, then essentially you have planning graphs that are essentially can be used to compute estimates of the length of plan for supporting any goal. The idea essentially is the way the planning graph would be constructed is that you'll start at the initial state, put every action that whose preconditions are holding in the initial state, put all its effects in the next level. Everything that is in the previous level, there is a special action saying persist me. If there's a P in the previous level, it is a persist P. That's a dummy action which will get P back here. That is to make sure that you take into account this no-op action. Okay? And once you do that, you now essentially, if you do all the actions, then you get a whole list of propositions. This is called the first proposition level. Now, in this proposition level, it has the following property. Any real state that can happen in one level in the progression tree is a subset of this Big Bang. You understand what I'm saying? Think of the, you went and bought, you bought like, some groceries, and you bought some groceries, you bought some groceries. We did, instead of deciding who bought which groceries, we said, yeah, pour this all into this big drum. Now, if I want to see, if there is any real, if somebody said, no, by the way, I definitely did buy onions and tomatoes and green peppers. If your Big Bag doesn't have any onions, any tomato, any all three of them together. That means if your Big Bag doesn't have onions, tomatoes, and green peppers together, they are faking it. How did they go away unless I'm pouring it and they just sort of vaporized? But if they're actually there, they still might be lying. I'm somehow looking at Dennis as if he is the guy who always lies. But it's not that. Because they may actually only have got onions and green peppers. Somebody else got tomatoes and potatoes. They poured together. Now you have onions, green peppers, tomatoes in the same Big Bag. What does that mean? If a state is feasible, it will be necessarily a subset of the proposition list. So that means any state that is not even a subset of the proposition list is infeasible. That gives you, for example, a lower bound as to how many actions do you have to do, even if there are no negative interactions, to get the goals into this proposition level. This is why the entire set of heuristics were in terms of levels. If you look at the first level, where if you're trying to figure out how far is from the initial state is the set of goals G1, G2, G3, in your case, tomatoes, green peppers, and whatever potatoes I said, right? You look for the first Big Bag, which has all three. That's the minimum number of levels you need to go. That means the minimum angle length. That's basically the line graph. Okay. So one of the interesting questions, of course, is if you have this idea, then if you can actually compute instead of just, if you are trying to compute the cost of PQR, which is the goal state, you can compute the cost of P, that means the first level where P occurs. Cost of Q, the first level where Q occurs. Cost of R, the first level where R occurs. Now you have L1, L2, L3. If you believe everything is independent, you add them up. If you believe there are positive interactions, you take the level. For the first time where they, if you believe that there are positive interactions or negative interactions, you take the first level where all three are together. Now it turns out actually, because of the structure of this graph, this graph has a tenure system. If a condition P comes into the proposition list here, will it ever go away in the next proposition? No. This is what's called tenure. Once you are tenured, you will be there forever.
What term did you?
I'm sorry. I'm saying the word tenure. Tenure is what professors get. And once you get them, then you have to keep on listening to them until they take them away in a stretcher from their office. Anyway, so that's either another. But so the facts get tenured, right? Because the facts get tenured, if L1 is, if P is occurring at level 1, Q is occurring at level 2, R is occurring at level 3, they have no negative interactions. Then the level which all of them will occur will be 1. But 3. Because the first guy comes and waits, second guy comes and waits, the third guy, when the says, yeah, okay, you finally are here, all 3 of us are done. So level heuristic is actually the max heuristic. It takes the max of the levels, max of the lengths, and then they say that's the max won't work if there are negative interactions. Right? If one goal is P, and that can be reached in one step, another goal is not P, that can be reached in another step, one step. There is no number of levels that you can go where P and not P repeat. In the case of negative interactions, it will be more than the max. But if you ignore negative interactions, if you take just the level at which the state, the goal state is occurring, that will give you the level. That will give you a heuristic value using planning. Okay? And there are all sorts of interesting things you can talk about. I won't go into too many details. You should read the paper, the tutorial paper if you're interested. I'll make you do some homework. So probably that way you learn. But it turns out, for example, that neither H level nor H sum will always work if, in fact, there are negative interactions possible. Okay. So, for example, in this particular case, imagine that every action gives a different. Every action gives a different literal. B1 gives P1, B2 gives P2, etc. B100 gives P100. So the length of P1 to P100, I mean, by the level heuristic, is 1. But really, even if there are no negative interactions, you do need B1, B2, B3 all the way to B100. So level won't be enough in that case. In fact, you actually need to introduce all the actions to support each of them. Similarly, then you say, oh, no, the problem is in this particular case, had you added them up, you would have been done better. Because P1 is 1, P2 is 1, P3 is 1, and Pn is 1. If you added them, acted as if they are independent, then you get H sum. That will actually be the correct number. Except that would be wrong in this case. Here, there is a B star which gives P1 to Pn. In that case, the level is again the right one. So a better idea than a level heuristic is you look at this graph, you decide what are the goals you need, and you back chain and say, I need for each of the goals, I need somebody to support. And for everybody who I'm taking them in, I will need to consider their preconditions and then support them. In this case, they're directly in the initial state itself. And I will say this subgraph is the plan. You add up the number of actions in the subgraph, that will give you the plan. That will work here, it will also work here. You know what I'm saying? So if you extract the plan from the planning graph, extract the sub-plan for supporting the sub-goals in the planning graph. Okay? You extract the sub-plan for getting the sub-goals in the planning graph, then that, and then add up the number of actions in that planning graph and all the levels together. That will give you a better heuristic, assuming only positive interactions, than either sum or level. Okay. So that what I just said is called H relax. It's basically finding a relaxed plan. It's actually just like, remember normally how is planning done? You have goals in puzzle link planning. You have goals. You support each of the goals with actions. You work on their preconditions. Remember? One worry in the puzzle link planning is people will get into trouble because of the negative interactions. They're all parallel in the beginning, but they can't get along, and so you have to shift them around. If it's only positive interactions, it's all kumbaya. The only reason plan will have to be longer is because different actions give different conditions, which may then be used as a precondition by other actions to give the conditions you want. So it's like almost like link planning. You're just finding the subgraph that supports the subgraphs. Having said this, HRelax, computing HRelax, it looks like computing HRelax. I'll stop in a couple of minutes and then we'll have a longer break, but we'll have the 15-minute break. But computing HRelax is essentially finding a feasible subplan, right? Without negative interactions. But if you only find a feasible subplan, feasible subgraph, that won't be admissible. That won't be admissible. So if you really want to find the optimal, if you want admissibility, then you need to search and find the optimal subgraph. Okay, finding the optimal subgraph of the planning graph is NP1. And NP1 is low price to pay given that the actual problem is piece-based. If you don't care about optimality, you only care about admissibility. I mean, you want to care about just the feasibility. That means the plan actually works. You can do normal analysis. That's not what I'm saying. By the way, any of you heard of the idea called query plans in databases? Have any of you taken database courses? Query plans in databases. If you have, essentially there is a SQL query. In fact, somebody said, whether you say it's SQL or SQL tells me what sort of a bozo you are. So I am a better bozo because I say SQL. And so if you take a SQL query, right, and you're trying to execute it the most efficiently on the underlying database, you need to kind of probably decide which sub parts of the query are run first and then which subparts and which subparts. There is an idea called query optimization, query plan optimization. There are optimal query plans. Are there negative interactions in query plans? No. If you're only looking at retrieval queries, how you retrieve from the database can never change. Can never change the database itself. So query planning can be written as strips planning with just positive interactions. And if you only cared about feasible query plans, database people will laugh at you. Saying, what do you mean feasible interaction, feasible query plan? Of course, any query plan is feasible. The only point is optimal. So positive interaction plans, even so there the problem itself only has positive interactions. And you know that optimal query planning is actually okay. Okay, so one more thing before you go off, which is how does this idea get used in progression versus regression? So I'm constructing the planning graph, right? And then I'm using that to compute either the level of the goal state or the relaxed plan supporting the goal state. How do I actually do it? If I'm doing it in the progression, strangely enough, for every state that I get, I need to construct a new planning graph. Because planning graph is constructed from the initial state onwards. And then in each of them, I will look at the goal. Suppose that if you're going progression in normal classical planning problems, the goal will always remain the same. The final goal is, let's say, PQR. So you construct a planning graph from this state, this state, this state. In each of them, I check the level for PQR or the relaxed plan for PQR. Okay. And if you want to see a nice animation, that's a nice animation. You know that I didn't make it because I can't make this kind of animation. So for each of the states, you're constructing the planning graph. Your computer is constructing it. And within that planning graph, you're checking the levels and so on. Okay. This is actually done by Dan Bryce, who is the lead author, who's an old PhD student. This sort of stuff. Anyway, but if on the other hand, I'm going in the regression, I just, initial state always remains the same. Right? Initial state always remains the same. So I need to construct one planning graph and I keep it forever. As I'm going regression, the regressed states change, so the new goal states will be checked with respect to the same planning graph. Take a break for 15 minutes, during which you think which will be faster. The progression where for every state you have to construct the planning graph. A regression where you just construct one planning graph and you keep looking into it. Okay.
Oh, that's.
Okay, Dennis, can I get an empty sheet from your? And then write your name and pass it on. I want to see people. Suddenly there are, it doesn't matter what, because people asking questions on the piazza or not, or they didn't know that they asked the question. Okay, guys. So I'm having an attendance sheet pass around. Basically because I realized that the two people who asked questions about mean center analysis apparently weren't there. Either that or they couldn't tell what questions they asked. So either which way, it'll be like a sanity test. So there's a sheet going around, write your name, and we'll know who's actually showing up. Okay. I must admit, I should mention to people that are new to me that I don't care if you drop the class, but if you're in the class, you better show up. I don't care if I don't teach, but if I'm teaching, I have to show up. The same for you. Okay, that's the basic idea. I'm not yelling at you. It's very stupid to yell at people who are in the class. This is being recorded for the bozos who are watching later. Yeah, never yell at people who didn't show up. Doesn't make any sense. Anyway, so the two questions. Okay, actually, first question is a simple question. I said, grow the planning graph. When does this planning graph growing stop? How far will you grow? Right? Basically, remember there was this whole notion of planning graph that somehow you have a proposition list, again actions, again proposition list, again actions, again proposition list. When does this stop? I mean, again, if you read the paper, you know this, but the question is, the thing to understand is planning graphs will eventually saturate because of the tenure system. Once anybody comes in, they won't go away, right? Which means at some point of time between the ith level and the i+1th level, the proposition list has the same propositions. At which point extending it any further is not going to change the planning graph. Do you guys see this? That's what is called level off condition. And you stop growing the planning graph when it levels off. And it levels off when two consecutive proposition lists are the same. Right? Okay, that's worthwhile. I mean, you should have known this, but I'm just saying it again. The other, so which one will work better? Progression or regression with the planning graph? With the planning graph heuristic. What is your intuition? What? Regression. Because you're only constructing planning graph once. Right? Remember the first time around progression or regression, we thought regression. Because progression considers every action that can be done in any realistic world. There are way too many actions that can be done. There are only there are much fewer actions that can be regressed, over which the goal state can be regressed, because they must be doing something useful and not violating any of the rules. And yet we found out that regression is not actually better than progression if you don't have any heuristics, because actually regression has partial states. Partial states can have inconsistent partial states, which means they're dead. And if they're dead, if you extend them, you actually can do worse. And in fact, progression works normally better than regression for simple domains where essentially it's like, there's not too many relevant literals. If there are irrelevant literals, tons and tons of irrelevant literals, progression will work worse than regression for no heuristic case. But the heuristic is actually bringing the goal directedness into consideration. So saying progression doesn't know where the goal is doesn't matter because your rich uncle, which is the heuristic, knows where the goal is. They are slowly sending you towards the goal. So with heuristic, that aspect is not wrong, but you still thought that there's like many planning graphs being constructed for progression, only one being constructed for regression will be better. Hey man, I believe that, but it's not. If you actually do this, it turns out most of the time, regression planning would essentially do worse in general than the search would be worse in general than the progression planning. Why? Because of the same damn reason. Because it is true that the planning graph has to be constructed only once. But you are checking whether the goals are present in this planning graph. If you are lucky, if you are okay, normal lucky, people would give you planning problems to solve that are actually solvable. Agreed? Which means the original goal state is actually feasible. I could give you planning problems which are not even solvable. That means even the original goal state is not feasible. And you don't know it, and then I say, But most of the time I would have given you a problem that is actually solvable. So the original goal state is feasible. But all bets are off when you regress the original goal state over an action. Those states may not be feasible. If they are not feasible and you are only considering positive interactions and ignoring negative interactions, then you could actually be doing the dead man walking, dead man growing exponentially. That's the reason regression actually does worse. So then you will say, hey, wait. What if we start taking some negative interactions into account? Those gray things that you saw, those were negative interactions. So the idea for negative interactions, this I showed you already. The idea for negative interactions, and this is basically what I just said. Historically, heuristic was first used in the progression planner, then they used the regression planner, then they found the progression planners do better. Then they found that the combining them is even better. That's a different point, but actually, yeah. So let me, before I get to the negative heuristics, let me also say, how will you use this kind of heuristics for plan space planning, if at all? Right? One idea would be that at any given point of time, you'll have a plan like this. Right? So the question would be, that means basically the things in blue are the part of the plan already. The plan space. Okay? And then what you're trying to do is how many more actions have to be added, the red ones have to be added for it to become a real plan. But we know only states in the planning graph. All we have here is this guy has some preconditions, this guy has some preconditions, this guy has some preconditions. Normally, these preconditions only have to be holding at the action. They don't all have to hold together in some state. You understand that? Everybody's preconditions have to hold in front of them. Right? However, if you assume there are only positive interactions, no negative interactions, then you can collect all the preconditions of all the people, make them true before, and then they just persist to the place where they are needed. You see what I'm saying? So, I need lunch, you are the lunch delivery guy. I need lunch, somebody else needs lunch, somebody else needs lunch. Each of us eat lunch at different times. If there are no negative interactions, that means lunch when once bought doesn't become cold or start having bacteria. Then you can just make your life simple by just buying all 3 lunches, put it in your car and give it to us when we need it. That reduces the mileage. On the other hand, I care about things like the lunch should be hot when I'm eating it and it is eatable, etc., which are kind of negative interactions. Then you need to go multiple times and getting everybody's lunches at the time they want it. So positive interactions essentially mean, only positive interactions means you could have considered all the preconditions together and made them true upfront. So even though it looks like a plan with different actions, I can take the union of the preconditions and say that's the goal state. And I can check the distance of the goal state in the planning graph from the initial state. That will give me an S. That will give me basically the same kind of guidance that you get for progression and relation. Okay. So the other thing I mentioned is negative interactions. And how do you take negative interaction into account is the whole entire work there. I mean, I asked you to look at the paper, but I want to remind you that the way to look at the negative interactions is to go back here. To go back. Remember that picture, I actually construct the progression tree, remove the membranes, and got the proposition list. It's a great conceptual tool. You should never do it that way, but it's a great conceptual tool. When you remove the membranes, if you remove them carefully and kept some of the structure, then you can still remember which ones were together in what bags. The only way to reconstruct the bags correctly is to actually never remove the membranes. You see what I'm saying? But suppose I have put this entire proposition list, but then I realize that, hey, this guy and this guy are in two different bags. They're coming from two different bags. The green peppers are coming from Dennis's bag, and potatoes were coming from Courtney's bag. Since there were two different bags, they were never together in a single bag. So I'll remember that, and I'll put a link saying they are mutually exclusive. You see what I'm saying? This is pairwise negative interactions. If the thing is that the pairwise negative interactions are actually pretty nice, reasonable place where if you can easily propagate them while you are constructing the planning graph. So you would do construction of the planning graph just the previous way. You construct the first level proposition list. And then for any pair of propositions, if the actions supporting them are interfering, then they would be marked mutually exclusive. And the actions supporting them are interfering if in fact they can't actually be done together. They can't be done together if their preconditions are interfering. Okay. So one way actions can be interfering is action A1 requires P, action A2 requires not P. So you could possibly have done both of them in the same state. Action A1 requires P and action A2 gives not P. In which case too, you couldn't do them parallelly because, what if, when you have parallel actions, they can be done in any serial order. And if you wind up actually doing the one which deletes P first, then the guy who needs P would be done afterwards and it won't work. Right? So this is basically called interfering actions. Okay, a more generalization is if action A has precondition P, action A1 has P precondition, action A2 has not P as a precondition, they're interfering. What if action A has precondition P, action B has precondition Q, so they're not normally interfering. But in the previous level, P and Q are marked mutually exclusive. That means they were not actually possible together. That means these actions were actually interfering, which means whatever they are supporting are mutually exclusive. You see what I'm saying? So you propagate the mutual exclusion relation essentially. You propagate the mutual exclusion relation with some simple rules. That two actions are mutually exclusive. Any pair of their preconditions are mutually exclusive. Two conditions in the proposition list are mutually exclusive if every way of doing the first one is mutually exclusive with every way of doing the second. It's harder to say two goals are mutually exclusive, right? Because if G1 can be done in 3 ways, G2 can be done in 4 ways, let's say, and they're all different actions. G1 can be given by A1, A2, A3. G2 can be given by B1, B2, B3, B4. There are 12 pairs of actions. If any pair of those actions can live together, then G1, G2 are not mutually exclusive. Only if every pair are mutually exclusive are G1, G2 mutually exclusive. And you do this, and you basically, while you are propagating the planning graph, you propagate the mutual exclusion relations. When do you stop? When the graph levels off. When does the graph level off? Between two levels, not only are there no new propositions, there are no new mutual exclusions. And interestingly, mutual exclusions have a tenure which is kind of opposite of the normal propositions. Mutual exclusions between a pair of conditions will slowly weaken, if at all. They can never become harder. If P and Q can be satisfied together in level 1, they certainly can be satisfied in level 2, because you don't do anything, they'll be true in level 2. If they can't be satisfied in level 1, they may still be satisfiable in level 2, because you do those actions in serial way and you can do it. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So mutual exclusion slowly relax away. But then between two levels, when there is no more change in the mutual exclusions, there are still mutual exclusion relations left. Those are called persistent mutual relation exclusions. So there could be mutual exclusion between conditions for a level specific mutual exclusion. I mean, so in level K, they can't be. Within level K, you can't do both of them together. But if they are mutually exclusive in at the level of, that means they can never be none. That means there's no plan. What's up? Okay. I normally show this. I won't show you probably. I won't go through this. Where is my Dilbert? Yeah, Dilbert cartoon. You should read this Dilbert cartoon about how Valley actually takes, he gets commended for taking his holidays, and whereas this woman, I forgot her name, Alice, essentially is being chastised because she hasn't taken all her leave, by this thing, and she says, am I supposed to do all the work I'm supposed to do, or take all the leave I'm supposed to take? These are mutually exclusive. Hello? You can't do both at the same time. So Valley just decided to focus on taking the leave part, and so he got commendation. But anyway, so that's a mutual exclusion. So there are goals that may not be doable together, And so once I have mutual exclusions, so this is the set of rules, mutex propagation rules. And the paper also has this, for two actions A1 and A2 when they are mutex, to proposition P1 and P2 when they are mutex. I already mentioned it in words, but it's written there. You do this recursively, and you stop when two labels don't change. You have a planning graph. Then the question is, what is the level heuristic? The level heuristic, basically, if I have a planning graph with mutual exclusions, and I'm trying to see what is the level at which G1, G2 is true, I need to look for the first level where G1, G2 is there without mutual exclusions. Because what is the point in having G1, G2, but there's a mutual exclusion? That means they're not actually possible there. So if I have n goals, G1 up to Gn, then I need to look for the first level G1 up to Gn are present and no pair of them have a mutual exclusion. That is the minimal level at which they are actually sort of kind of. Okay. Now the question, of course, is because they are mutually, because by that level those goals are not mutually exclusive, does that mean that there actually exists a plan to achieve all those goals by that level? You know that in the normal planning graph, that's not true, right? If you, the first level where G1 and G2 and G3 are present, and then you don't even do mutual exclusions in normal planning graph, is let's say 5. That doesn't mean that there's actually a feasible plan of length 5, which will get you to those goals. Now I'm doing mutex. Am I guaranteed? No, not even then. Because what happens is, all I did was I did pairwise mutual exclusions. I can have scenarios where there are 3 people. Every pair of them are good friends. The 3 of them, if you put them in the room blows up. So I need to do triple mutexes. Say even and way. There can be 4 friends. Every doubles and triples can get along. All 4 of them can get. You see what I'm saying? So then you say, why don't you just propagate n-ary mutexes? If you propagate n-ary mutexes, then you are essentially solving the full-on planning problem many times over. It's not any longer heuristic. N-ary mutexes will give you perfect heuristic. Perfect heuristic is overkill because all you need to solve is this one problem. Whereas perfect heuristic solves every possible initial state to goal state problem for that goal state. You guys understand what I just said? So n-ary mutexes are useful to understand, but nobody does them because they're very costly. Okay. This is a level-based planning graph with mutex relations. Okay. The final thing is, how about relaxed plan with mutexes? Remember, I only talked about level heuristic. I didn't say planning, relaxed plan, like the way I did in the previous positive interactions case. You know why? Because in the positive interactions case, only if you need the optimal subplan do you need to backtrack and consider all possible subplans supporting, all possible subgraphs supporting the final goals. In the negative interactions case, if there are mutual exclusions, then even finding one subgraph that supports all the goals such that there are no mutual exclusions in the subgraph will require exponential amount of work. Okay. Actually, historically, this idea of planning graphs was done by a guy in the theory department called Avrim Blom. He didn't actually know or care about progression, regression, plan space language. He thought planning problems look like flow problems. Let's do some kind of max flow kind of stuff. Except they're not actually flow problems because there is non-linearity. Because if all the preconditions are not satisfied, the valve doesn't work. The flow is that the water is flowing into the preconditions and then it's coming out into the effects. Right? Except unless all preconditions are satisfied at the same time, the effects won't get turned on. So you have to come up with a more complex max flow problem, the flow algorithm. The flow algorithm that he actually came up with involved generating the planning graph up to level K with mutual exclusions. Searching backwards for a subgraph to see if you can find a valid subgraph that supports the goals, which involves doing backtracking because the things that you picked, the two actions that you picked to support G1 and G2 might have preconditions which are mutually exclusive, in which case you have to pick different guys. And this can happen anywhere down the line in the subplan. So you will try to find out a subplan. If you can't find it up to level K, then he expands it by K plus 1, does the whole thing again. That was what's called graph plan. And when that guy came from other side and these people are all going from plan space, blah, 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 then we were all trying to make sense of this, and we realized that essentially planning graph construction that he's doing can be seen as a heuristic for progression regression and plan space. Furthermore, if you were to think of searching a subgraph of a K-length planning graph with mutual exclusion relations, you see what I'm saying? That can be written as a satisfiability problem. Turns out you can write it as a set of satisfiability clauses, a whole bunch of them, such that if you can find a satisfying assignment for all the propositions such that all the constraints are satisfied, then there will be a subgraph. It shouldn't be surprising because satisfiability is NP hard, NP complete. Finding the subgraph of a K-length graph, which is feasible, is also NP complete. If you want, you can call this bounded length planning problem. That means instead of saying, can you find me a solution for this problem? I can say, can you find me a solution for this problem that is at most K levels? And even though Avram did graph algorithms, actual graph algorithms, I mean, I will send you guys a link. This was 1995, and this guy essentially made a postscript animation. PDF wasn't being used that much those days. He made a postscript animation, which kind of looks like this other one that I showed you earlier, that Dan Bryce did. Except he did this. Yeah, he did this in PowerPoint. Pattern postscript. Except, in Dan Bryce, he's only doing the planning graph and showing it. For every planning graph he does, he will actually do the backward search, looking for subgraphs and showing the backtracking. And then if it finds, it stops. Except notice that he doesn't do multiple planning graphs. He just has one planning graph that's being grown to level 1, level 2, level 3, up to level 3. Okay? He did an actual graph algorithm. But it turns out that if we actually write it as a SAT instance, then you are essentially computing the graph. The way he's computing the graph is doing it backward. It is starting from the goal, supporting actions, finding their preconditions, etc. But you write it as a SAT instance, then you can do it directionless. Essentially, SAT basically is giving values to propositions from here, from here, from here, from here, until it finds an assignment that satisfies all the questions. It turned out that graph plan was not as fast as the compilation of graph plan into SAT. Okay? And it turns out one other piece of information there is that, so actually there were these people in AT&T Bell Labs who then figured this out, and they realized that they can convert graph plan into SAT instance. And in fact, it turns out that you can actually directly, even without graph plan planning graph, you can write bounded length planning as a SAT instance in general. And so they were doing that, and they were doing very fast. And then they took part in the first planning competition in 1998. And they lost pretty badly. But they lost very fast. In the sense, they will return, we'll say sec for, return, sec for, return, sec for. Why? Why it so happened that they were checking whether or not their algorithm is working on AT&T Bell Labs, which was rich enough to have 8 gig RAMs in desktops in 98. Everybody, even my small nephew's cell phone has 8 gig RAM. No, I'm sorry, I'm talking about 1998, where Bill Gates was saying nobody needs more than 640 kilobytes of memory. Okay, so AT&T had 8 gig RAMs. The point is that, remember, depth first search is space efficient. It only has to remember the length. B times D is the space. So you can do implicit reasoning without putting everything in the memory. But if you take the planning graph, convert it to the SAT instance, you first need to load the SAT instance. You die right there. That's what I'm saying. Why would they have any problem? Because they were doing it with the 8 gig RAM, and then the competition was held in CMU, which was a state-of-the-art school, not a company. So just like you guys don't have GPU clusters that Google has now, those days, CMU said pretty good, reasonable memory would be 32 megabytes. So they gave a whole bunch of workstations for everybody. Everybody should be working on the same workstations. All of them are 32 megabytes. Everybody else's planner was chugging along because it was doing some kind of a depth first analysis and keeping the memory and the thing. These guys were getting done very fast. The moment they convert it to the SAT, it doesn't fit, seg fault done. Okay. So then I had a student called Mindo who actually basically thought SAT and CSP are essentially the same problem, with the difference that in SAT, the clauses are explicitly represented. In CSP, constraints are just pieces of code. And you ask the piece of code, is this a partial assignment that is still consistent with you? You say yes or no. If you can do planning graph, subgraph as a SAT problem, you can also do it as a CSP problem. So he wrote an idea called GPCSP, which just converted the planning graph into a CSP problem, where the constraints are essentially implicit. That means they are like pieces of code. So if they take hugely less amount of space. But unlike SAT, which can do unit propagation on all the classes because they're standing in front of them, CSP is sort of, you have to call the code and say, are you okay with this? And then call another piece of code saying, are you still okay with this? He did much better in terms of solving the problem. So much so that in 2000, he wrote that paper. In 2000 he wrote the paper. In 2010, he got the influential paper of, Okay. Why did I say this other than the narcissism that I'm for? Think of SAT as domain model with actions, preconditions, and effects written in front of you. Think of CSP as an opaque simulator which takes a state and gives you states of it. You understand what I'm saying? There's no difference. They're both solving the same exact problem. SAT and CSP are solving the same exact problem. So are planning with the domain model or planning with simulator. The difference is with the simulator, it's not that simple to draw a planning graph in front of you. You have to kind of do multiple calls to the simulator to even construct the planning. So in general, thinking of the distinctions between CSP and SAT will make you think of the distinctions between planning with a domain model and planning with a simulator. And the reason that is important is because much of what goes as reinforcement learning is reinforcement learning with simulator. So there is actually conceptually no difference between strips planning with a domain model that you assume is complete and reinforcement learning with a simulator that you assume is complete. The rest is syntax nonsense. Syntax can make or break, just as we got a best prize for GPCSP by killing SAT. But conceptually, SAT and CSP are solving the same problem. So reinforcement learning with known simulator, a simulator that is assumed to be correct, is solving the same problem as planning with the domain model or planning with simulator. In one case, the reinforcement learning is slowly figuring out pieces of the domain model that matter by making repeated calls to the simulator. It's useful because most of the ideas that I'm discussing here are also relevant to reinforcement learning. Anyway, so it turns out in 2001, we were doing all this planning graph stuff, and so the intro to AI textbook essentially was written by Russell and Narvik. That chapter was written based on the discussions there. I mentioned that I want to talk to you about a little about landmarks, which is actually a whole entire area for heuristics. But as I said, the idea of landmark is, again, you're starting from the domain model and trying to figure out eventually whatever is the plan, there are certain sub-goals that it must satisfy. So here is a simple way of recursively computing the landmarks. Suppose I asked you to solve a planning problem with G1, G2, G3. I would argue that G1, G2, G3 are landmarks. That means every eventual plan at some point of time should have satisfied G1, should have satisfied G2, should have satisfied G3. Maybe it satisfied all of them at the last minute in the final state. Maybe it satisfied G1 first, and then after a while G2, after a while G3. But it has to go through states where G1 is true, where G2 is true, where G3 is true. So I would say G1, G2, G3 are fact landmarks. Now I can recursively say that suppose there is only one action, just make it simple. There's only one action called A star that has the effect G1, G2, G3. And nobody else can give any of G1, G2. Then I'd argue that eventually, irrespective of what your plan is, it will have A star. It's possible that A star has preconditions, so there is more actions, but you need to have A star because it's giving G1. Or a more general case, it turns out that there is an action, only one action called A1 star that gives G1. Nobody else gives G1. Only one action called A3 star that gives G3. Nobody else gives G3. G2, dime a dozen. Lots and lots of people give G2. I would say A1 star and A3 star are action landmarks. Because eventually, because G1 and G2, G3 are landmarks, the only actions that can support them must be present in every final. And then once I figure out the action landmarks, then I can then do recursively their preconditions, the same analysis on their preconditions. Because their preconditions now become mini sub-goals, mini sub-goal lists. So basically, landmark analysis can be done this way. Not only that, you can also get some kind of a precedence ordering between the landmarks. So for example, if A star gives G1, G2, G3, A star then has P1 and P2 as the preconditions. G1, G2, G3 are landmarks. P1, P2 are also landmarks. But P1, P2 are preceding G1, G2, G3. So I can have basically, I don't know what state trajectory you will go through, but you are likely to go through state trajectories where these kinds of states will occur with the following properties before the states with the following other properties. If I have this kind of landmarks, which can be constructed again just from the domain model. And it's worth actually, I'll give you a paper to read, but I don't have the time right now to go through that too. Those give a new set of heuristics. And in fact, they are more popular these days in planning problems than planning problems. But they're also computed directly from the domain models. So it sort of shows you this particular one basically showing how the operators supporting goals, that causal connections can be used to compute the landmarks. And remember that bridge analogy, that will still work. A bridge is an action landmark. If there are only two bridges, then it's a disjunctive landmark. You will either go to bridge 1 or bridge 2. And that you figure this out just by looking at the domain model. And finding the landmarks is cheaper than finding the actual plan. Just like finding the planning graph is cheaper than constructing the full plan. So landmarks can be used as the basis for this. Okay. So there are both fact landmarks and action landmarks, and you can have algorithms, recursive algorithms that compute them from the domain model directly from the so then the same domain model from which you construct the planning graph, you can construct the landmarks. Okay, I wanted to get here because I made these slides, and this is the reason I got delayed. Yeah, I want to do this before which is, this is all nice. This is I was talking about yesterday kind of years like 1995, 1998, 2000. Many of you are not born, and you're thinking, why am I taking a graduate level course? Of course, physics was not even before that used to take it. But like the point I want to make is ideas have uses across time spans if you actually understand the bigger connections. Otherwise, you reinvent the wheel and pat yourself very hard on your back, saying very shiny wheel. If you don't know, then it's new for you. Okay. So I want to ask you the following question. This is generally about heuristics. Why should heuristics come only from the precise model being used by the planner? That's what we did till now. Right? Basically, what we did was, the domain model is going into the planner. There is a heuristic generator which takes as input the same domain model. Right? It works. And in fact, if you do this, there are all sorts of advantages. You can talk about whether it's complete, whether it's admissible, all that fun stuff. But if all you are thinking of is that heuristic is just giving guidance to the underlying search, and the underlying search is sound, that is, the planner itself is sound, then why does it matter that I use the same domain model that the planner used? Maybe I can use some other, even weaker domain model. Or I can use a much broader domain model. One worry you might have is, well, if you do that, maybe admissibility won't be guaranteed. Yes, admissibility is not guaranteed. Optimality is not guaranteed. The other worry you might have is if you do some other domain model, so that is basically I'm asking for this idea. That is, instead of this domain model being used for the heuristic generator, I have some other model, and that is being used to construct the heuristics, which are then being used to guide the planner that is working on the domain model. Then the question is, where is this funny looking some other model coming from? And what kinds of things might you want to use? Well, and then before that, I said you might lose admissibility. Yeah, nobody really seems to care about that. Push comes to shove, as I used to mention to you guys, some of you, the difference between computer scientists and hackers is computer scientists know optimality, they know that they lost it and they'll save money. And hackers don't say, what are you talking about? The thing works. Now, what completeness is a bigger issue. If you don't even find the solution, then there are two issues. Okay. Optimality, admissibility. The other is soundness. That means the planner gives a plan that doesn't even work in its own model. I can do some other model for heuristic such that the planner gives a plan that won't even work with the domain model. that it has. How many of you think this is possible? Convince yourself that that's not possible. Because the search is being done by this guy. This guy constructs the states based on this domain model. And it stops only if its goal criterion is satisfied. Not because some rich uncle said, yeah, enough time is there for you just go take rest. No. So underlying planner is sound, so it will never ever give a solution that is not actually correct with respect to its domain model. Soundness is guaranteed. Soundness is guaranteed. Admissibility we won't get. Completeness we can get because of that discussion I told you earlier, where you change infinities to big numbers. You never pruned anybody. It just becomes an efficiency issue. You understand what I'm saying? Now, if you're coming from strips kind of models, you might think, why would I want to look for any other model? Okay. So that these two other models could be, for example, it might be the case that the planner has a simulator, a black box model, like the CSP. And it's working at too low a level. And the kind of heuristics that you can actually extract only work at a higher symbolic level. So you might give it a higher level model, which is not the level at which the actual planner is working, but the higher level model might give it landmarks, which then the planner can use. Saying that you have to go through the bridge doesn't say you should use this particular kind of car or this much speed for the car. Those are all low-level details. I let you do whichever car, whichever speed, but I just say you have to go through. Useful piece of information. So that can happen. You could have what you could use abstract models. Let's talk about that first. So the union abstract model actually. Suppose the planner is using a laboriously constructed domain model or simulator that takes into account low-level conditions. And the human experts give you high-level abstract model of the domain with no guarantees about its completeness or soundness even. One of the most beautiful things about heuristics is the model guiding the heuristic doesn't have to be sound. You know that, right? Because if you ignore negative interactions, the plans that work in the relaxed domain don't work in the real world, in the full model. So they're not sound in the full model. Right? Okay, so the human experts can give you high-level abstract model of the domain with no guarantees about its completeness or correctness. Other than that, it mostly kind of works. Then you could use these abstract models to derive heuristics that can then push the low-level plan. That's what Lin did. And he got an ICML paper this year. More or less, he will yell at me saying, no, that's not exactly what I did. Since I'm here and he's there. Okay. So essentially, he starts with an incomplete symbolic model, extracts landmarks, uses these landmarks as sub-goals, and drives the underlying planner. So, there is actually an ICML paper that you can read this year, and I'll probably make you read it at some point of time, and we will discuss this. But I want to show you that the ideas just cross time scales. Okay. I'm lying. I'm sort of lying a little bit. He didn't actually think that we had planner because ICML won't publish planning papers. What part of L in ICML don't you understand? L has to be learning. You want learning? I'm doing planning. I'll do planning with black box simulator, RL. I call it RL. You see what I'm saying? So I just tweeted this morning, yesterday, in preparation for this class, that result, there is no conceptual difference between strips planning with a domain model assumed to be complete and reinforcement learning with a simulator assumed to be complete. You know this. Lin kind of knows it because I made him agree with this. I SML reviewers say this guy's doing learning. If you wrote the same exact paper with a planner working on a more complete, low-level domain model, they say, no, go to some other conference. We are learning it. Reinforcement learning with a known simulator is deductive reasoning. Real reinforcement learning, as I said in the very first class, you die because you actually work in the world. In simulators, you never die. Just, brush off your clothes and move on. So it's actually reinforcement learning is a kind of a lazy way of extracting the domain model inherent in the simulator to do planning. So what did he do in his paper? He essentially used a symbolic model to compute the landmarks, computed the sub-plans for these sub-goals, these landmarks are sub-goals with precedence relations, using reinforcement learning. The terminology is sub-plans or options. It's the options, you're talking reinforcement learning lingo. You understand what I'm saying? Accents matter. In the world that we live in, accents matter. But people who know that accents don't really matter, but it's just syntax, can learn to speak any random accent. Like, for example, notice how seamlessly Midwestern accent I have, right? Okay. So the point is, you can think of the connections between whether you call it planning or learning, or whether you call it CSP or SAT. Conceptually, the problem is same. And if you know that, that's where the ideas come from. Individual papers, they are final instantiations of an idea. Where do ideas come from? You take courses to understand where ideas come from. Okay. So in fact, whether you see reinforcement learning operating on a simulator assumed to be complete, you can, wherever you see reinforcement learning operating on a simulator assumed to be complete, which I can guarantee you is every damn reinforcement learning paper right now. Because in fact, Yannick shows if cars were doing real reinforcement learning, and he'll show the car dying off all the time. If cars are falling off the cliff, other cars or people in the other cars will learn. Maybe that's not a good idea. But you yourself, you're gone. Reinforcement learning winds up being a way of lazily using the domain model that is compiled into a simulator. Just as CSP can be thought of as SAT, except instead of SAT, which actually can directly manipulate constraints, CSP has to ask the constraint piece of code saying, are you okay with this? Are you okay with this? Okay. So there's little, so whenever you see reinforcement learning operating on a simulator assumed to be complete, you can mentally substitute planner with the domain model assumed to be complete and use everything you learned in this course there to get your ideas. And just in the last minute, remember, say reinforcement learning, say options, so that you can get your I-7 papers. With that magnitude. Okay? That is first part. That is making Lynn unhappy. The other part is, so I could be a union abstract model where I'm getting a heuristic. In fact, interestingly, the model that he comes up with in this work, the model that the incomplete model that the human gives, incorrect incomplete model that human gives, has not really any restrictions. There is, because they were interested in proving a theorem. In fact, they said under certain conditions, it will at least be complete, modulo, you live long enough for the search to complete. Okay. And that conditions essentially what they call MVTR condition. And what that says is you found a bunch of landmarks, right? If there exists at least one real trajectory that works in the lower level, that goes through those landmarks, that even one, not everything, just one, then he will be complete. How do you know that is the case? How do you know that subgoals are serializable? You ask strips whether you can solve it. Similarly, METR is a normative condition. If it happens to be true, then I will be true. Okay. Again, remember what I'm saying. Papers are read by people like you and me. And so it's basically the knowledge that collectively we have. So the next thing that I want to talk in the next 15 minutes is to go even further and say, instead of union abstract model, why not some kind of a universal weak model? It's not about Bloxford. It's not about logistics. It's not about any single thing. It is a shallow expert in everything. It's no good for, it's jack of all trades, essentially. In general, actually, I differentiate between deep and narrow. AI and broad and shallow. Yeah. Broad and shallow is jack of all trades, but sometimes it has advantages. So what if you have such universal weak models that we can use? The interesting thing is LLMs are symbolic. They are kind of jack of all trades. They'll give some kind of an answer. If you ask LLM, give me a plan, they'll give you some plan. It won't work. But they'll give you a plan. Yes, we can see that. Oh, sorry. Let's do this again. Now it works. Okay. So this was Karthik running a bunch of Bloxford problems by giving the Bloxford problem input, initial state, goal state as a zero-shot prompt and asking for a plan. The good thing about LLM is they never shut up. You see what I'm saying? That's the good thing about jack of all trades. You know that, I know this. Whereas the serious, narrow people will say, no, this is 3 millimeters away from my expertise, so I would rather not talk. LLM, yeah, I know. I'm equally bad or good in everything. That's what a universal weak model is supposed to do, right? Except if you use them directly to generate plans, so you take their advice to actually run the planner, get the plan and try to execute it, you die. So basically, what Karthik showed was Karthik and Alberto and Sharat basically played with GPT-3 and showed that they have 0.6% accuracy. 0.6% accuracy. That means out of 500 problems they gave it, for 3 of them they gave plans that actually work. That was the paper that I mentioned in the beginning of the semester, and there was like a write-up on that also. But if you have jack of all trades, you want to make fun of them, this is what you do. If you want to leverage the jack of all trades, you use them as a heuristic. As heuristics don't have any requirements. Because the underlying planner, as long as the planner is complete. You understand what I'm saying? So you're trying to solve a problem in your job, right? And your job depends on you actually solving that problem and that piece of code working. You're passing by and you see your friend who acts like a wise guy or a wise girl. And you ask, hey, what do I think? What do you think I should do? And they think, you should do this. And then they go off home. They just gave you the advice. If it works, they'll take credit. If it fails, they'll say, hey, you didn't pay much for it. You got the advice. It's your job, not mine. You understand what I'm saying? You only ask this other friend because you are so devoid of ideas. You are like stuck with so many options to do. You wanted somebody to tell you something. They told you something and you tried it. And if it works, it works. If not, you get something else. You understand what I'm saying? It looks very sad from the august heights of knowing the complexity of the problem, doing the heuristic, computing the cost of heuristic, figuring out whether they are improving the plan efficiency or not. But honestly, I would argue that in real life, when somebody says I used a heuristic, they talk more like this than like what we were talking in the rest of the class, where I knew the exact domain in full detail. I chose to ignore some details, used a relaxed model, computed a solution because Russell and Narvik and Rao told me in 471. That's not what we call heuristic. It's like heuristic is another name for heuristic is thumb rule, a rule of thumb. Where do rule of thumbs come? Just randomly, they're floating about. And then, it's like I was passing by and cop said, maybe try this. You see what I'm saying? As long as the underlying planner is sound, it will never give out an unsound plan. It can either be faster or slower because of error. And if the underlying planner is extremely slow to begin with, you can only win. What I'm saying, if the underlying planner or the reinforcement planner is extremely slow to begin with, there is humongous of room to improve. That's actually a lot of what is going on in reinforcement learning right now. In most pixels to actions reinforcement learning, the problems are so hard that any kind of advice can be shown to be improved performance. That's probably true in real life too. Like, you say that, what are the advisors? I'm an advisor to Lynn. I told him, I'll try these ideas. If it works, he gets a paper, I get credit. If it fails, I say, you should have done better. See what I'm saying? So but I still get paid as an advisor. You understand what I'm saying? So it's a positive way of looking at it. LLMs can be a useful thing. So why might we consider such universal weak models? Because planning or RL simulator gives guarantees when you are solving problems covered by the domain model. They will guarantee that this is optimal, this is sound, etc. But anything outside the model, imagine you have a Blackstone planner par excellence. It can do any on A, B, on B, C kind of a problem. And you say, just put A above C. Say, what is above? And you have to write that definition of above. Most people who didn't know anything about Block's world knew that on and above must have translation, because that's the common way on and above are used. LLMs will not, without you telling them, in fact, even without telling them whether using it in Block's world or some other world, they will assume more or less that above is sort of transitive relation. I mean, they don't necessarily understand what transitive relation is, but they will realize that correlation between above or not. So they don't give up, but they're no good in anything. They're jack of all trades. These guys will be correct when they speak up, but oftentimes don't speak up. Like students here. Right? So weak universal completion models of the kind LLMs learn don't give any guarantees of soundness. That was the Karthik's experiment, because it just basically showed you get 0.6% accuracy, not by design, but just by fluke. Okay, but they have better generalization powers. They can, for example, effortlessly connect above and on from common sense usage in their humongously large corpora, web-sized corpora. Web-sized corpora won't tell them what the plans for this domain are, because that's too hard, because nobody actually wrote plans for Block's world and posted them on the web. Okay. So why not combine this and this? In essence, this is sort of like what Lynn was doing, except in Lynn's case, he thought the higher level model is still being given by the human. Here you are saying the higher level model is whatever the LLM says the model is. If you do that, LLMs can be used to generate some weak, incomplete, relaxed, high level heuristic advice for a complete lower level planner or RL plus simulator. Nobody talks about planners, as I said, because of just fashion. But RL plus simulator is a plan, whether you like it or not. Like Dimitri Batsakis will be teaching a course on reinforcement learning. You should probably take it. Most of you should take it next semester. He comes from control theory. Control theory is inference. So he considers reinforcement learning essentially an approximate dynamic program. Okay, it doesn't have the sexy word learning, but really at some point of time he realized, hey, they call it learning than most students. But it's the same idea. Okay, so given a high-level instruction, LLMs are going to give some completion, but these completions are not grounded in the world. They may not actually work, but they can be used as some kind of a guidance by an underlying sound planner, which doesn't know any good idea. So it at least try the idea you do. So you're stuck. You don't know how to write this code. You asked in the shopping complex, you found your friend, hey, what should I do? They said a couple of things, you do like it. If you're lucky, might be one other one. Yeah.
Is this analogous to transfer learning to create policy for reinforcement?
Again, what I'm saying is, I'll get to that, but the word transfer learning is just as badly overused as the word generalization. Remember all my discussion about generalization earlier, where I say, I know you gave me a picture, I changed one pixel value, and I'm still solving the problem, generalization. The real question would be, what is a domain? In fact, people talk about domain transfer. They're not talking about blocks for domain being transferred to logistics domain. They're talking more like a domain where there are like 5 blocks to a domain where there are different colored 5 blocks, for example. That's just a different domain. Okay, it takes a while to understand this, but I mean, the connections, but it's little more than just that connection, the idea transfer. So anyway, so for example, if you ask, I spilled my drink, can you help? Is the way you're telling your friend. I got stuck in this random, code. Can you help? They'll give some random advice. So for example, GPT says you could try using a vacuum cleaner. Lambda might say, you want me to find a cleaner? And apparently Flan with another LLM says, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to spill it. I don't even know what Flan is. Anyway, I didn't see this. But this idea that I'm talking about, which is use LLMs to generate advice, which then is actually filtered by a complete planner or an RL system, was used recently by a system called CSE574 from Google. It has a humongous number of others. Right? In fact, fewer number of others than the GPT-3. I mean, GPT-3 authors themselves actually created a corpus, I think, in terms of their names. But humongous number of authors, and what they basically wound up doing is this idea. The proposed method is LLM essentially is computing, and they use random, this is actually a set of slides that Karthik made when he presented this problem, this paper to us in the group. So I'm not quite sure whether he's actually directly used their wording or not, but the metaphor they were using is LLM is the brain, and the planner that makes sure that the advice is working is the slave. Okay. So similarly, your friend who was passing by in the Costco or the shopping complex gave you an advice is the brain. You who is trying to figure out whether that advice works or not, because your job actually depends on it working, to the slave. Okay. But I think it's a better analogy is to say LLM is a weak heuristic guidance, and it's being used by the complete but narrow planner. And it will always be sound. Okay. So in particular, it essentially, like how would I move the coffee to the counter, for example? It might just, I think so. How would you put an apple on the table? That's the question. Large language model might give you a whole bunch of completions. In a real world, whole bunches of ways you can do on something. Many of them may actually not be doable in the environment that the robot is operating. Do you see what I'm saying? So I can give you advice that's not feasible given your GPUs in your office. But you get to check. I get to give the advice, you get to check. And if the RL system essentially looks through this and essentially figures out which ones are working and uses that to push the search forward. I mean, there are a lot more details, obviously, because it's a actual, it's a simulator-based reinforcement learning system. That essentially is what SECAN is. That's a way of understanding in the grand scheme of things of ideas. Where is a system like SECAN? It says we are using LLMs to do planning. You say Rao said LLMs can't do planning. Different things. Rao is still right. LLMs will never be able to do planning. They can give empty advice, which may work sometimes. If you don't have any ideas, you have like infinite number of options. Somebody says, try these 5 things. Oh, that's like a good thing. In fact, if you draw nice little curves, you might actually even be able to show that you have improved performance. Because in the previous case, you probably would have just tried all the infinite number of things in the first level. Here, at least you did some kind of a beam search. You understand what I'm saying? So that is basically SECAN. Okay, that's basically SECAN. And that's what I wanted to get across to you, that these ideas of heuristics, if you think of heuristics as being coming from a model that's not the model that the planner is using, then they still work. In fact, in case of Lin, he started with a model that is not the real model, but you could compute landmarks within it and use those landmarks to run the planner downstream. You see what I'm saying? So I'm going to end here. I actually would have liked to tell you what's going to happen next class, but in essence, one little thing that I want to mention, if you don't mind giving me like 4 more minutes, I want to give you like an idea of what Sharath will be doing as to why this kind of configuration. So up until now, you're thinking of just actually a single model based plan. There's a single correct model the planner is working with. By the end of today's class, I said there are 2 models. One model that is maybe giving the heuristics, the other model that's actually the planner. But suppose I'm actually talking about the correct models and the planner is having a single model, then, given the model, MR, which is the, robot has a model of the world, say PDL model assume, then it can take an initial state S, goal state G, it can compute a plan. That's what we did in the last 4 weeks. If you put a human in the loop, which is actually another agent, but it's not just an automated agent, it's like human, okay? One of the interesting questions is human has their own model of what the problem is. They have their own goals, they have their own actions. That's M of H. And the robot essentially is looking at solving the problem while understanding what the human's model is. What are the actions, what are the goals? Oftentimes, this is what goes under the name of goal recognition. What is it that the human is trying to do? So that you can help them or you can get out of their way while you are doing your own goals in the robot's area. This is human in the loop plan, right? The third thing is once the human is in the loop, human has a model of the problem, robot has its own model of the problem. Humans will have an approximate idea of what they think robot thinks is the model of the problem. If you don't believe me, this is exactly what you do when you see somebody else. When you say you don't make any sense, what do you mean? You don't make any sense given what you think your model should be. And you are not behaving according to my model of you. So it's not MH, which is the human's model of the task. It's not MR, which is the robot's model of the task. It's MRH, which is the human's approximation of the robot's model of the task, which is unfortunately possibly wrong. Because it is wrong, they might be thinking you are doing something inexplicable. Then you will tell me, no, Rao, don't expect me to be able to do this because in fact you have a wrong model of it. So when you have this, you basically, the planner's planning becomes very interesting. It now is trying to satisfy an initial state to goal state problem, which should be consistent, which should be sound with respect to MR, because MR is essentially what the robot is executing the plan with. But it should be close to what the human would think the plan would be for the same IG goal, according to MRH. If it is that, they're happy, they won't get it. If it's not, they'll say, "Hey, what is this? Why are you doing it different?" And then when that happens, that discrepancy happens, that MRH is different from MR, the robot, just like you, can either say, "Okay, I don't want to argue with Rav. Let me do what Rav expects me to do. Not what is better for me, but what Rav expects me to do." In fact, if you don't want to talk in your life, your spouse, your friends, just do what they expect you to do. You never have to talk. Mostly they'll ask because, "Why are you doing this?" If you're doing exactly what they expect you to do in every situation, you'll never have to talk. If you're trying to save on talking, and I'm told men except try to save on that, just to do what people expect you to do, you're better off. But doing what people expect you to do is essentially explicable planning. It is a plan that works, but it's not optimal in MR. It's not what you would feel comfortable with, but you're doing this just so that I won't be surprised. It has a cost for you. Sometimes actually finding a plan that works in MR and is optimal in MRH might be infeasible. Notice the interesting constraints. It not only should work in MR, it should also be optimal in MRH. It might even be infeasible. So the other option is to say, "To heck with it, I'll do what I want, and you'll ask me some dumb question, then I will tell you, okay, your MRH of me is wrong in this place and this place and this place." If you change your model of me, you will understand why I'm doing what I'm doing. When people say explanations, that's what you're doing. An explanation is changing others' mental model of your abilities. Now, the simplest explanation, when I ask you, "Why do you do this?" You say, "My brain, take it and stop bothering." Other than in addition to the fact that brains are gooey and you kind of stain my clothes and stuff, it's too overly large an explanation. I just want you to know why you're doing this one thing. Why tell me your entire life story? Explanation should be to the point. Should be with respect to the question I ask. The kind of questions I'll ask you, "Why are you doing this?" typically would be followed by, "Why are you doing this? Why aren't you doing this other thing? Why are you using action A1 to support G instead of action A7? Those are called contrastive explanation phrases. And then you provide an answer to that by just telling me that changing my MRH enough that I can realize that A7 is worse than A1. That's what explanation is. Sharar, not being as fast as I am, is going to take full 2.5 hours to explain just what I said the last 5 minutes. But you will understand.